Hi and welcome to the SP-808 Video Owner's Manual. My name is David Wells and let me first up congratulate you on the purchase of the SP-808. What an awesome box. You know, Roland has got such a great heritage of the dance music market. I mean, they probably made the most popular drum machine of all time in the TR-808. You have the bass line, the drum line, the Juno series. I mean, there's just so many cool things that Roland have come up with, so you can be sure that they're going to do it right in this box, which they have. You've got sampling section, you've got hard disk recording, you've got a whole bunch of effects, and you've got the innovative D-beam. And by the end of this tape, you're going to be an expert. I guess the first thing we should go over is the front control surface, so let's take a look. We can break down the front panel of the SP-808 into roughly 6 different sections. The recorder mixer section is where you'll find the 4 stereo tracks that you record on along with their corresponding faders. You'll also find just above that the locator section, which will allow you to locate to any portion of the song that you're working on, so you can directly go to, say, the chorus, the bridge, or any other location you desire. Speaking of getting around your songs, you'll also find the transport section along the bottom of the screen with the standard buttons that will allow you to stop, play and record and move around measure by measure. Now, directly above you'll see the edit section where you'll perform edits on tracks and samples. You'll spend a lot of time here, so we'll devote a good portion of the tape explaining the various edits that you can perform right here. In the lower right hand corner you'll see the sample palette section that gives you access to over 1,000 samples arranged in a set of 64 different pad banks, each with 16 samples ready to go. Just hit a pad and away you go, make some noise. This is also where you'll be doing all of your phrase sampling here. Now, directly above we have the real-time effects section that gives you access to 20 different types of effects algorithms that can be stored into any one of 99 user presets. You also have 99 read-only effect presets built into the SP-808. And finally, we have the D-beam, which will give us real-time control of pad triggering, pitch, and effect parameters, all at the wave of a hand. Much of the feedback you get from the SP-808 comes in the form of the large LCD panel in the top left-hand corner of the control surface. Now, depending on how deep you get into editing, it can sometimes be easy for a new user to get lost. Well, don't despair, because getting back to square one or home base is as easy as hitting the play button. The play button toggles through 4 different screens. The first 2 are level viewing screens. The third, a graphical representation of your playlist. And finally, we've hit the big time. This is what Roland calls big time. This gives you a nice big screen to see exactly where you are in the song. It's perfect for viewing on a dim stage. Now, on looking around the front panel, you might notice that a lot of these buttons have secondary labels underneath them, indicating that they can do different things if they're selected in conjunction with the shift button. For example, selecting the play button normally toggles you through the 4 play screens, right? Well, hold down the shift key and then select the play button and you'll access the contrast info screen, just as the label says. Spend a moment playing with the front panel with the shift key selected and explore the added functionality of each button. As I mentioned before, much of the work you do on the SP-808 revolves around the edit section here in the prime real estate right on the front panel. Here you can edit songs and tracks, change the settings of the overall system along with any disk management, or editing samples and banks. Editing on the 808 involves selecting one of these 3 buttons, let's say the song, scrolling through the various options listed on the screen by using the value dial, and then selecting that option by hitting the enter key. Now, everything you edit on the SP-808 will basically come down to these 3 keys and the various levels underneath that. So depending on how deep you get into that menu hierarchy, it might take you a reasonable amount of time to get to the edit screen you particularly want to use at that time. Well, Roland had a great idea by placing a number of hotkeys on the front panel here that take you directly to the edit screens you'll be using most frequently, all by hitting the quick edit buttons. For example, let's say I wanted to change the level of a sample. I can hit the Sample Bank button, select the first option, Set Sample Parameters, and scroll down until I see the level. From here, I can use the value dial to change the level of a particular sample. Roland kind of anticipated that this is going to be a parameter that we're going to be wanting to tweak on a regular basis. So instead of getting to this screen by pressing that series of buttons we just pushed, we can hit the Sample Level Quick Edit button, and that will take us directly to this screen. Now, you may not think this is much of a time saver, but once you start doing a lot of editing, you'll be thanking the guys for Roland for putting this in. Once you're in any of these screens, you can find your way around by using the 4 cursor buttons here to move yourself up, down, to the left, and to the right. You might notice that the 4 cursor buttons here have secondary labels underneath them. They have secondary functions: erase, paste, cut, and insert. And as we said before, these are brought up by using them in conjunction with the Shift button. We'll be getting into far more detail as the tape goes on, but for now, I hope you have a basic overview of the front panel and how you get through the various screens. Let's begin our tour by looking at the back panel. The back panel consists of a number of RCA-style jacks that give you inputs and outputs to the unit. The input section consists of 2 stereo pairs of RCAs that feed the main line input and also the aux input. This is normally where you'll return your external effects devices. You'll also see a mic input that accepts a 1/4-inch jack. Any type of dynamic or electret condenser mic should do, and you can adjust the sensitivity of its input on the front panel just above the play screen. In fact, all 3 types of input have gain adjustments here. The inclusion of these 2 stereo pairs really help you out in a DJ situation. You could place your CD players in the line and the aux input there and the mic input and get away without using any mixer at all. The output section has stereo pairs for the master out and an auxiliary output that can be used for either an effect send or as a separate cue mix for the sample pads. There's also a headphones output, a foot switch input to allow you to control your SP-808 from a foot switch, and finally your MIDI ports to allow you to connect to your other MIDI devices. If you really want to have some flexibility with your outputs, look at the OP1 upgrade. This add-on board gives you independent stereo outputs for the first 3 tracks, as well as SPDIF digital ins and outs along with optical ports as well. This expansion card also gives you a SCSI interface which allows you to back up or write to an external zip drive. Well, we've pretty well gone over the entire control surface of the SP-808. Let's cut to the chase and make some music. There's basically 2 ways that you can play sounds from the SP-808, either from the sample palette over here to the right, or from the playlist that's generated from these tracks on the left-hand side here. Let's go to the sample palette first. As I mentioned earlier, the sample palette gives you access to 64 banks of 16 pads. To play a sample, just press its corresponding pad. Now, if you want to keep a pad playing while you play others, you can either play a game of finger twister, or you can use the handy dandy little hold button down here to do the work for you. Just hold a pad and then just hit hold. Now that button is flashing, showing you that sample is being held. You can play other samples on top of it. If you want to hold others, just hold them down and hit hold. Now both those guys are being held. If you want the pads to stop, just hit them again. This helps you get really busy with complex live performances, but a word of warning, you can only play up to 4 stereo samples out of the SP-808 at any time. Now, this might seem like a limited amount of polyphony if you compare it to a rack-mounted sampler like, say, the Roland S series, but keep this in mind. This is a sampler that plays samples directly off disc infinitely long compared to rack-mounted samplers that play just short samples out of RAM. This is not your average sampler. It's a whole lot more than that. By the way, this limit of 4 stereo samples refers to everything coming out of the 808, including the tracks. In other words, if you were playing back 3 tracks in a song, you'd only be able to play back 1 sample at a time from the pads, but of course this limit is easily overcome by resampling. More on that to come. Now, moving through the 64 pads of samples is as easy as hitting the pad bank and using the value dial to go through the various listed banks that are available and hitting enter when you find one that you like. But there's also a shortcut. You can load any one of the first 16 pad banks just by hitting the pad bank button and selecting any one of the 16 pads. This will take you directly to the corresponding pad bank. You can see them all loading up now. While we're looking at the sample palette over here and the pads, you might notice that some of them work a little differently than others in the way that they respond to you when you play them. Say, for example, some only play when you hold them down, while others will play with you just tapping them. This is because each pad can independently decide how it responds to you playing them in any one of 3 different ways. Let's hit the sample bank button and go ahead and press enter in order to go to the first option, set sample parameters. Here we'll see a parameter called pad play. And using the value dial, you can see that we can select gate, trigger, and drum. Let's go over them and select the pad here, number 5, and see what happens when the pad play is set to gate, the first option. Sure enough, the pad behaves just like a gate or a momentary button. You hold it down and it plays, let it go and it stops. But if we use the value dial here to select trigger, it acts like an on-off button. You don't need to hold down the button to keep the sound playing. You turn it on, you turn it off. Now the third option, drum, is kind of modeled after a drum hit. You hit the pad and it plays. It goes through all its sample data once through only. This is good for things like cymbal crashes and things like that. You can also use it to get that cliched sample effect that we all know and love. Now, if you wanted to use sample pads all day long, play them from the front panel, you certainly can, but chances are, after a while, you'll want to use them to lay down loops in the recorder section on any one of these 4 tracks. Let's load up a demo song and play with the tracks. Hit the song track button and select the first option by hitting enter. Select song. You can now select any one of the songs that are on the current disc. Let's scroll to number 3 and select effective. Are you sure? You bet. This will load up the song along with any relevant pad banks, and from the play screen we'll be able to monitor the output of the 4 tracks along with the master output as well. Let's go ahead and click on play. Now, only the tracks that are selected, that is, they are lit up with a green status LED, will play. You can mute any track you like by deselecting their status button. And by the way, do you remember me talking about the limit of 4 stereo samples coming out of the SP-808? Well, in fact, you might notice that if I select all 4 tracks, here we go, all 4 are green here, the sample palette will go away when I hit play. If I want to play along, I need to deselect at least one of these tracks, then I can play along. You can adjust the level of the 4 tracks, obviously enough, by using these 4 white faders here. But please take note, if you're using the optional OP1 card to give you separate outputs of these guys, these separate outputs, these faders will not be operational on the level of those separate outputs. Now, the grey fader here gives you double duty, actually does double duty, between controlling the level of the sample pads at the moment and also the level of the mic line input. If this light is on, it is controlling the pads, and if you hold down Shift and hit Scrub, the light will go off, and you'll notice that now it's not controlling the pads. In this case, with the light off, it will be controlling the mic and line level. So let's get our hands dirty and do some sampling. I have a CD player here hooked up to the line input of the SP-808, and I have some CDs here from East West. If you're not hip to these guys, you should be. They've got an awesome collection of samples, and you'll find all their information at the end of this tape. So let's go get a new empty pad bank and we'll hit the sampling button. The sampling screen will come up with kind of like a fuel gauge here of how much sample time you have left on your disk. Let's go through each parameter here. Now type, the first parameter here, gives you the choice of stereo or mono samples. You'll notice that the remaining time will double if you select mono as your sample mode. Let's go ahead and we want to record something in stereo here. The next parameter allows you to decide what is going to trigger the beginning of your sampling. Let's go ahead and select manual. This will have you starting and stopping the sampling process by hitting this flashing sampling button. Let's go ahead and cue up our CD player. As soon as I want to start, I hit start. Once I hit it again, it stopped. Let me stop my CD player. And once you've recorded the piece you want, just hit any one of these pads in order to audition the piece that we just grabbed. Now if we're happy with that, just hit enter to keep it. Automatically the next pad will light up ready for you to sample some more. Now instead of starting up sampling by manually hitting the sampling button, we can also have sampling start once a certain threshold has been reached. In the same screen that we chose manual for the start with parameter, we can use the value dial to select any one of the 8 different levels that need to be reached so that the sampling will automatically start. If you're sampling from a CD player or a fairly quiet input, you can probably get down and get away with, say, level 1. If you're using a live microphone, you might need to set the threshold just a little bit higher so that you don't accidentally start sampling too early. And if you want to make sure that you don't miss the very beginning of a sample, you can use a certain amount of pre-trigger so that the SP-808 will actually back up a certain amount of milliseconds before it detects the threshold. Boy, that's pretty tricky. It works really well for sounds that begin with a very fast transient. For example, like say a hand slap. That starts with a very fast transient, and a lot of samplers will miss that because by the time that threshold has been passed, the sampler starts recording, that beginning, that slap, has been missed. With pre-trigger, the SP-808 will catch that every time. The last two settings here will allow you to set the sample start to either a pad or the play button. This is really useful if you want to resample from a pad or from a track. Now if we move a little further down in this screen, I'm just scrolling down using the cursor buttons, you can see that we can auto-trim our samples. Auto-trim allows the SP-808 to trim the silence at the beginning and the end of your samples, leaving you with presumably the good stuff in between. Now the parameter of where it thinks that threshold of silence is not tweakable, but it does a great job 99% of the time. There are times when it may not do a good job if you wanted to sample sounds with a very slow attack or a very slow decay, like say a string swell for example. If you're going to be sampling sounds like that with a slow attack or slow release, turn the auto trim off and manually tweak them by the numbers. Now auto divide is perfect for lifting off samples off of loop libraries or sound effects CDs. Typically these types of CDs have a whole bunch of short individual samples that you have to sample one at a time. You have to manually cut them up and assign them one by one to each pad or across the keys of a keyboard sampler. Well, auto divide takes all the drudgery out of lifting samples from these types of CDs. Here's an example. Set the auto divide to about 1.5 seconds and cue up your CD. We'll hit sampling. And we're waiting signal. Let's click on play on our CD player. Now it's sampling. And it's going to auto divide them up and place them onto different pads. I think that's probably about enough. So we'll click on stop on our CD player and we'll click the button here, start stop sampling. It's now working on that. And once that little progress bar goes across here, you can see all these pads are lighting up with the individual elements that we've recorded. If you enjoy using samples from sample libraries such as these guys, this is a huge time saver. I can't emphasize that enough. There's a lot of drudgery in taking this stuff out. Roland has done a wonderful thing here. It's going to save you hours and hours. Along those same lines, if you ever want to take off sounds, say, from a friend's drum machine, you can set auto divide as well and just plug up your friend's drum machine, hit each pad one by one. SP-808 will divide them all up and assign them across your pads. Once you've captured some samples, you want to be doing some editing, and you'll find all of the edit screens that you'll be dealing with basically come underneath the sample bank button. Let's take one of our samples and edit its start and end points manually. The first option underneath the sample bank button is set sample parameters. Let's go ahead and click on that, and we'll move down to the start point here. From here you can select how fine or coarse you want to be as far as selecting the start, loop, or end points. Obviously enough you'd expect. Moving the cursor to the left moves you in a far more coarse way, where if you move along to the right you can go in much finer increments. Now, for example, let's go to the beginning of the sample that I just recorded, and you can hear that the sample comes in just before the downbeat. Let's go ahead and move that up. Let's use this. I just want to sneak up on the kick drum so that we can trigger the pad perfectly in time with the beginning of the bar. Let's go here. There you go, I'm right up on that kick drum. This is something you'll just be getting better and better at with practice. Now, if this sample is going to be a loop that repeats over and over again, you're going to be wanting to tweak the end point or the length of the sample. And the SP-808 has some really neat ways of accomplishing this pretty quickly.
Hello, tech support.
How do I use the tempo of a sample to set start and end points of my loops?
If you know the tempo of the sample that you just lifted, you can adjust the length here until the tempo lines up with what you want. I know this loop had a tempo of around 160 BPM. Okay, let's try it here. From just that information there, I can get really close to having a perfect loop. The SP-808 assumes that you're recording a single bar of 4/4 music and does the math accordingly out from that. Now, if you're going to be recording music in stranger time signatures or longer phrases, you can always adjust for this underneath the BPM bass note and the number of beats parameters. Now, if you come from a more graphical background, you may want to use the scrub function. While the cursor is someplace on the start point line, hit the scrub button and you'll see a graphic. Let me just turn that down a bit. You'll see a graphic representation of the waveform. Now you can use the cursor buttons to zoom into the waveform if you like for a better view. Hit the up and down to zoom into the amplitude of the waveform, and the left and right will zoom in and out of the timeline. You can use the value dial to adjust the start of your sample, and sometimes actually I find it easier to look for the start by eye rather than listening to it, so feel free to hit the mute button if you like every now and again. I reckon that probably looks like the beginning of the kick drum. Also, if you want to move around the waveform a little more quickly, use the shift button in conjunction with the dial. You can adjust the endpoint in the same way by selecting it in the sample parameters screen and then hitting scrub. Now there's also one last way of setting in and out points, and for me I think it's the most intuitive. Hit quick edit trim and make sure that the cursor is someplace on the start point line. We'll hit enter and this screen will come up here. Hit enter to set the end point. Here we go now. So as I hit enter as soon as I wanted that start point to be set, let me check that out by hitting the pad on the pad bank. I'm pretty close. I could trim that back if I like, just so I can get that kick drum. There you go, perfect. You can do the same thing with the endpoint by selecting the endpoint in the sample parameters and hitting enter. Now this will be cruising along. We'll hit our, that's our endpoint there. Oh, sorry, here's the endpoint there. 2, 3, 4, boom. I'll place my out point there and let's check out the loop. I could always hit my start and end point manually if I don't get right there, but you'll be surprised at how many times you can nail it the first time using this method. Time stretching is a way for you to change the duration of a sample without affecting its pitch. Basically, you decide what the new tempo will be, either expressed as an absolute BPM or as a percentage of its current length. Let's go through it. Under Sample Bank, select number 5, Stretch Time. From here you can see the source pad, the one you are stretching, and the destination pad where the stretch sample will go. As I mentioned a second ago, you can set the new tempo either as a percentage of its current length or as an absolute BPM. You'll notice that the two interact with each other. In other words, that the longer the sample will be, the lower the resulting BPM will be.
Hello, tech support.
How do I match the tempo of different pads?
Now, I know you know there's a lot of samplers on the market that allow you to time stretch, but the SP-808 takes this to a whole new level in the way that it greatly simplifies the way that you can match the tempo of a bunch of different samples. For example, let's imagine a friend of yours came over with a whole bunch of loops that they had recorded, and then you've been recording a whole bunch of loops from some of these sample libraries, and you want to mix them all together in one song. Here's the problem. You need to match the tempo of all those different samples. Well, the SP-808 allows you to conform the BPM of one sample. In fact, you can just match one pad's BPM to the BPM of another pad. Let's check it out. Let's just take a sample that I just recorded, and we're going to match it with a new pad, with one of the stock samples that came with the 808. Let me select that sample, and we'll hit enter. With just those couple of keystrokes, I've matched this pad to this pad. If we want to change the pitch of the sample, hit Sample Bank number 6, change pitch. From here it's just basically like time stretching in that you select the source pad and where you want that altered pitch to go to, what pad you want that to go to. You'll then select what your new pitch is going to be, either represented in semitones, or you can do that fine tuning. That's in cents, which is hundredths of semitones. The great thing about change pitch is only the pitch is changed. The tempo of the sample does not change. If you ever want to delete a sample, just select Sample Bank and go underneath the third option, Delete, and then decide which is your target pad that you want to delete. Let's hit 15 here and hit enter. Are you sure? You bet. Now don't worry if you've made a mistake, because undo, redo will light up and you can always hit that back and your sample will come back here. Always check to see whether this is lit up, because a lot of these edits are undoable. Now if you love to discover demonic lyrics in any heavy metal album you might have, or perhaps you want to check if there's any hidden messages in any political speeches, you'll just love sample pad option number 4, which is create reversal. In much the same way as we time stretch and change pitch, create reversal is as easy as defining the source and the destination. And of course, in any of these edits, you can always elect to write onto the same, where are we? Let's go down there, to the same pad if we like. There's always undo if you don't like the result. By the way, the 4 most common things you'll be doing with samples are given dedicated buttons in these quick edit buttons. Either trim or level, or with the aid of the shift key you can go to stretch and pitch. This will save you a lot of time. You won't need to wade through all those menus. By the way, there's one more setting underneath set sample parameters right down the bottom, and it's called mute group. From here you can allocate any sample to be part of the 7 mute groups, and basically this means that if there are a set of samples that are on the same mute group, only one can be played at a time. Probably the most obvious use of this function is the old closed hi-hat, open hi-hat routine, and when you have the closed hi-hat cutting off the decay of the open hi-hat, because typically an open hi-hat does not play once you hit a closed hi-hat. But you can use it for all sorts of creative ways for one sample to cut off the other sample, so your mixers don't get too busy. The SP-808 has just got a boatload of awesome effects that can be modulated in real time using the controls in the front panel. These include the real-time knobs on the front, the step modulator, which recreates the feel of the old analog type voltage step sequences, and the innovative D-beam. Let's check them out. If you just want to get a feel for each effect that comes shipped with the SP-808, hit the real-time effects on-off button. If you want to see what effect you're bringing up, just hit Effects Info. You've got 99 read-only presets and 99 user presets with which to play, and just select a number and hit Enter. When you select an effect, it'll take normally about half a second to load. Now, depending on the type of effect that you've selected, it may be patched into the signal path in one of two ways. Either send and return, or insert in either the master channel, the record channel, or any one of the 4 channels along here. Now, the first one, send and return, will be familiar to most of you who have used mixers before. Hit Effects Info and scroll to P01, Digi. We'll hit Enter. Digi is a digital delay, basically an echo machine. Now, along the top of each fader you will find a row of effect buttons. Clicking on them will add effects to that particular channel. Let's press the effect button on top of the mic line pad fader and play one of the pads. Make sure effects are on. That's without echo. That's with echo. So adding effects to any of these tracks consists of hitting the on-off button in the real-time effects and then hitting the individual effects buttons corresponding with each track. Now, adjusting the actual level of effect for any of these tracks independently is controlled by the effects send parameter. Hit Shift and Effects and you will find a parameter on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen that is labeled Effects. Let's scroll down to the pad section. We're dealing with a mic line section here. Here we are in the pad section, and here's the effect send here. Now, just like the effect send on a mixer, you can add more or less effect by turning the value dial. Let's have no effect. That's dry. Little effect. Little more. Lots of effect. Now, just to the left of that, you have the option of whether the effects are going to be placed pre or post fader. With the setting of post, the effect send level will travel and track with the actual fader. This method of adjusting the effect send is the same for each of these faders. Just hit Shift and Effects and you'll have all the effects send here. If you want to tweak EQ, you can move down a little further here and adjust the EQ for each fader. Now, as far as the effects send, if you hit Shift and the effects above the mic line fader, you have effects send for both the mic line and a separate one for the pads. If you've ever used effects before, you know that we can break them down into 2 very broad categories. The first category include things like, say, reverb and delay that tend to be used in an effect send and return situation. These are the types of effects that you tend to want to use sparingly. In other words, you want to have mainly a dry signal and then add just a little bit of reverb and a little bit of delay. The second category include things like compressors and gates. These are the types of effects that affect the entire signal. These types of effects you want to insert into the signal path. Depending on the effect that you've selected, you will either have individual control over the effect buttons. That means that the effect is set up for send and return. Or, if I give this example, P09, all on or all off. If the buttons behave in this way, that means that you've chosen an effect that will affect the entire mix. It's either all on or all off. It doesn't matter where you hit it. The location of a particular effect, in other words, if it's either in a send and return situation or an inserted effect, is preset at the factory, but it can easily be changed by going into Effects Edit. Hit Shift and Effects Info to get you to the Effects Edit screen. Now on the bottom right hand corner you'll see LOC for location. Let's move down there and select it. From here you can set the location the effects is patched into. Let's go through them. Set and return, as we've mentioned, allows you to set individual amounts of effect for each track or the pads. Insert, master, places the effects over the entire mix. That was the all on and all off we were looking at just a moment ago. Insert record places the effect on whatever you were recording at the time. This is great for bouncing tracks or resampling onto a different pad with effects, because even though you only really have one effect at a time, you can keep on adding effects again and again by recording over and over again. Insert aux out places the effects in line with the two aux out RCA on the back of the SP-808. The remaining options place the effects inserted into just one channel of the mixer, either say the mic line in either a pre or post EQ. There's mic line pre or post, track A pre or post, and so on and so on. If you want to modify an effect, there are many ways to do it. Probably the easiest is by using the real-time effect knobs. These three knobs have been set to control various parameters of each effect that you call up. For example, let's bring up effects info and go to one of my favorites, number 39, rate bit. We'll hit enter, and this is a pretty cool effect in that it can dirty up a whole lot of your sound. Say if you take a sound like this, and you can change the sample rate and also the bit depth to get really grungy sounds there. You have three knobs here. Well, actually you have six knobs because you have these three here and another virtual set of knobs by changing the row. Hit select row and you can see you toggle between these knobs being C1 through 3 and C4 through 6. You can see a graphical representation of each knob as you play with them, along with the label of what parameter has been assigned to them at the factory. If you want to decide for yourself what knob does what, you can easily go underneath Effects Edit and scroll down to CTL for control. Here you can set not only what each of the six knobs will do, but you'll also decide what the D-beam and step modulator will do to affect the onboard effects. Number 5, C5 here, and C6 are set up for the D-beam, the left side and the right side of the D-beam. And the last two are set up what happens when the step modulator is run. More on that in a minute. If you want to save any of your effect creations, you have 99 user locations for them. Just hit Shift and Enter and select 3 effects patch. I'll hit Enter. From here you can decide where the new patch is going to go. If you want to rename the patch, just go ahead and scroll through it and give it a new name. You can use the sample pads down here. You'll notice that each pad has a corresponding set of letters here. Just hit them consecutively and use Shift button to select capital letters. Now, apart from all the flashy effects that get all the attention on the SP-808, you also have a couple of very useful effects underneath the heading of B on the front panel. The first is a filter which allows you to change the overall spectral content that comes out of the SP-808. There's also an isolator that allows you to suck out entire bands of frequencies. Let's check them out. Normally the select row button toggles between the various controllers of the standard effects, between your first row and your second row of controllers. But if you use the shift with the same button, it selects between the A effects and the B effects, which is our filter and our isolator. Let's start off with the filter. This works like your standard analog low-pass filter that includes a low-end boost here to get the boom into your mixes. Just turn the knob to the right and up goes the boom. If the knob is all the way down, then you've actually added no bass. All the way to the right, and you've got bass for days. Now the second knob selects the cutoff frequency. At the max position, there's no filtering. As you go lower, all the top end starts to go away. And the third is resonance, and this will give you a spacey kind of sound that you get when the cue of a cutoff is changed. If you play around with these controls in real time, you'll actually get some pretty cool effects. And I'm probably getting ahead of myself here, but if you hit the effects button up here in the D-beam controller, you can control both the cutoff and the resonance by waving your hand over the D-beam. In fact, you'll notice on the front panel it's actually labeled on the left-hand side for cutoff and on the right-hand side for resonance. More on that in a little while. The isolator can be brought up by hitting the Select Row button here. Now we're down in the isolator section, and now we have complete control over isolating any of the 3 bands of the frequency spectrum. I'll turn them all to the minimum position here, and we should actually hear nothing. Turn the lows up, and all we hear is the low end. The same with the mids. And the same with the highs. If you want to hear the entire mix, just turn all the knobs to max. This is really handy if you just want to take, say, the hi-hats from one song and place it over another song. Then I could take a mix like this, take out the bottom end and the middle end, and all I've left with is, say, the hi-hats. Now, it's not like you can get totally precise and pull out, say, the piano track from one song or the snare drum from another, but it's pretty handy to make some entirely new remixes, and you can make composites of different songs. Now, the last thing we'll go through with effects is the step modulator, and probably the best way I can explain it is this kind of bizarre example. Imagine you could hire a little guy, he's like this big, and you can put him up on the front panel here, and he turns these knobs in time with the music. Like at, say, beat 1, he puts the knob here, and then at beat 2, he puts this here and puts this over here, and beat 3, he puts this here and there and over here. All of this tirelessly and perfectly in sync with the song that you're working on. Sound interesting? Let's select patch number 22 and see how we can affect the sound as we move the first knob. How about we use the step modulator and go on autopilot? As you can see, the left knob is moving all by itself. Now you might ask yourself, why is it knob 1 and not knob 2? And also, how does it know which way to move? Well, the answer lies in setup. Let's hold shift down and hit the step modulator button to get into the setup of the step modulator. We can see a bar graph representing up to 16 steps. You can see each of these steps, 8 on the top and 8 on the bottom. Now, by using the left and right buttons, and the cursor buttons here, we can move to any particular steps and see what value is assigned to each of those steps. Well, what do these steps mean? These are the internal settings of the step modulator's parameter at any point in time. And what you can do is assign this step modulator to any effect parameter to get some really cool effects. And what's more, this can be synced to the tempo of your song. If you scroll down in the step modulator screen, you'll find BPM. And the BPM can either be set to follow the song tempo, or you can set up for a particular BPM, particular tempo. Let's set up for song, and we'll play a track. Actually start from the beginning there. Now if we look at the effects and put on our step modulator, you can see that the step modulator is following precisely in the steps of the song. It's also on this screen that you can copy the values of the step modulator from another effects patch. Each effects patch has its own setting of the step modulator, and sometimes it's easier to copy those values from another patch than start one from scratch in your own. Well, probably by now you're screaming, what does a step modulator control? Well, the good news is, anything you like. Under Effects Edit, move across the right-hand side here where it says CTL, that stands for Control. Remember we looked over here a little while ago, we were checking out what the real-time knobs were controlling? Well, if you move down to the bottom, you will find STM1, STM2. These are the parameters that are controlled by the step modulator. Now, there are literally dozens and dozens of parameters that you can control with the step modulator and any of these real-time controls, but rather than me bore you for 2 hours of going through every single parameter, probably check out the effects section in the manual. Or better yet, just experiment, because until you hit save, that's shift and enter, you can't hit anything, so experiment away. Now, much of the power of the SP-808 lies in its ability to resample within itself, totally within the digital domain. That means with perfect quality. Any sound that you can hear out of the master outputs, you can resample within itself, either in any combination of, say, a track to a track to a pad, or a pad to a pad, each time with effects. So you can lay sound on sound on sound with different effects each time. Let's go over resampling from one pad to another pad. Let's decide on a sound to resample. I'm going to take this bass line and add a distortion effect to it. It was P37 that I brought up. So let's hit the sampling button. And we mentioned earlier about how sampling begins. It begins with whatever you select in the start with parameter. I want to start sampling as soon as I hit the pad that I want to resample. So select pad and hit sampling. You see that it's waiting for a signal. It's waiting for me all day until I hit a pad. Here we go. Okay, we'll hit sampling to stop that. And if we turn the effects off, we should hear the sample that has been layered with those effects. It's dry. How come? Well, remember when I said the effects location is a very important parameter? If we go into Effects Edit, that's Shift and Effects Info, and go down to LOC, that stands for location, and hit Enter, we can see that from here that the effects are inserted into the master bus. Now this will allow us to hear the effects through our speakers, but it will not feed this effect into the resampling part of the SP-808. Turn the value dial and select Insert Record. Now let's try it again. We'll hit Sampling. The next available pad will light up. If you don't want to record on that pad, you can always hit another. The SP-808 will always warn you if you're about to overwrite the contents of a pad that's already been recorded into. But for now, let's just select the next available. We'll turn on the effects and we'll hit sampling. It's waiting our signal, so we'll get our effect tweaking knob hand ready and hit the pad or pads that we want to resample. When you're done, hit sampling again. You can check the result by hitting any one of these pads, and if you're happy with that, just hit the Enter button. Now you can also resample from tracks onto a pad, complete with all of your fader moves and your effects. You can queue up your tracks. Just make sure that you set the play button as your sample start with parameter. And keep in mind that you can only record 3 tracks onto a pad. This comes down to our 4 stereo track rule, that you're playing back 3 and you're recording with 1. There's also one last thing about resampling that we'll get into a little bit later on underneath the track bouncing section later on this tape. Now, once you accumulate a whole bunch of samples, you'll want to arrange them in pad banks. And as we said before, we have 64 banks here, so you're not going to run out of them. But if you ever want to mess with a bank and you don't want to risk ruining those original samples, you can always copy a pad bank to a new location. Hit Sample Bank and scroll down to option number 8, which is Copy Bank. By the way, there's a shortcut to the bank options. You'll notice that the edit buttons are labeled Song/Track, System/Disk, and Sample/Bank. The dual nature of these buttons can sometimes be used by pressing them a second time. You'll notice that, for instance, if I hit the Sample Bank button, it reveals the first 3 options that would normally scroll through, and hitting it a second time takes us down to the bank options. Anyway, let's select option number 8, and we'll come to this screen, which is pretty self-explanatory. What bank you are going to copy, the source, and the destination, where the new bank will reside. Of course, if samples exist in the destination bank, you'll be asked whether you want to overwrite them, and you'll be given the option to do so in that case. If you ever want to erase an entire bank, you'll go underneath option number 9, Erase Bank. You'll just decide what your target bank is and you'll hit Enter to do that. Now, You want to be very careful with this. But of course, with this edit and any other potentially disastrous edits, there's always the undo button to get you back to square one. You can always tell when an edit is undoable by checking to see whether the undo button is lit. Sometimes if you're not careful, you can fill up a bank with a bunch of samples that are not consecutive. That is, they're scattered all over the bank with holes in between them. You can rearrange the samples so that they're grouped together with no blank sample pads in between. Hit the sample bank button and select option number 10, renumber. We'll hit enter and select the range of banks that you want to work on. I'll just select the same bank for both lines here, and when I hit enter, it will take a few moments to renumber them. By the way, most of these edits will not be possible in a bank that has been protected. You can turn bank protection on or off underneath option number 11, bank protection. If you ever want to move samples around the sample palette, the clipboard here provides a really quick way of doing this. Simply hold down the pad and hit clipboard. As you can see, the sample has moved from its previous location to the clipboard, and in fact you can even play it from the clipboard. Now to paste that into its new position, just do the reverse. Hold down the clipboard and press on the new pad where you want the pasted sample to go. It moves into the new location and the clipboard is emptied. If you'd rather make a copy of the sample rather than moving it, just use the Shift button in conjunction with the clipboard. Now, Roland's D-Beam is a highly expressive controller that can trigger pads, change the pitch of samples and tracks, and take effects to a whole new level. And beyond that, I mean, it's just so cool, and chicks dig it. Let's take a closer look. The three buttons that are in the D-Beam area of the front panel select how the D-Beam will affect the sound coming out of the SP-808. You can press one at a time. In other words, the D-Beam can either trigger pads, control the pitch of the 808, or control your effects in real time. Let's start with pad trigger. Press pad trigger and place your hand on the left and right hand side of the D-Beam. You'll notice that I can play two different pads depending on what side my hand is. In fact, I can play both if I want. The setting of which pad gets played by which side of the D-Beam you hit is underneath sample bank number 7, I believe, set bank parameters. You can also do this on the fly if you like. If you hold down pad trigger and hit the two pads you want to be triggered by the D-Beam in succession, now both of those guys will get... The first one you hit will be the left side, the second one you hit will be the right side. Now, you can also have the D-Beam trigger those various pads set up by the height of your hand if you like. Hold Shift as you press the pad trigger button and you get to the D-Beam setup screen. Scroll down to the trigger type, and instead of triggering the pads by moving your hand from left to right, you can select height instead. Now you can play the two samples by raising and lowering your hand. Now in this mode you can only play one sample at a time. There's no mixing between the two, but you can tweak where the switching between those two samples, what height your hand needs to be for the switching of those two samples. Under the D-Beam setup screen here, select the upper-lower ratio. A higher setting will have you getting really close to the front panel before any change occurs. A lower setting will have the switch happening further away from the panel. In fact, another setting of the D-Beam will have an effect here. You can select the overall sensitivity of each side underneath D-Beam setup. The higher the setting, the more sensitive the beam is going to be to triggering. In fact, don't set the sensitivity too high or else you're going to be having some false triggering problems. Now Tony, one of the product specialists at Roland's, hit me to a really neat tip as far as triggering these drum samples using the D-Beam. If you want to play drum samples using the D-Beam and you don't want to worry about them cutting off too quickly, set them to drum mode. Hit Quick Edit Trim and cursor up to pad play. Select the pad you want to adjust and set the pad play to drum. Now whenever you trigger that sample, it will play its entire length. This is pretty cool if you're in a DJ situation and you're queuing up maybe a new CD and you just need to trigger a sample just to give you a little bit of time. Plus it looks pretty cool. The next button is pitch. This allows us to change the overall pitch of the SP-808 using the D-beam. The lower your hand, the lower the pitch will be. You can select how much pitch shifting occurs by selecting the pitch width parameter in the D-beam setup screen. Narrow will bend you down about a whole note, medium about an octave, and wide will just send you right through the floor.
Hello, tech support.
How do I use the D-beam to control effects?
The third button allows you to control various parameters of your effects. We'll turn the real-time effects on and we'll select the effects button in the D-beam controller section, and we can now change the effect by waving a hand over each side of the D-beam. The two parameters that are affected by the two sides of the D-beam are C5 and C6. In other words, if you select the second row of real-time effect controllers, you'll see their settings change when you move your hand over the beam. This is basically exactly the same as you moving these last two knobs yourself, but now you have the freedom of doing those two knobs worth of work just with one wave of a hand. And in fact, if you have this hooked up through MIDI, you can send these hand movements out through MIDI. We're using continuous controllers number 80 for the left side and 81 for the right side. Now if you hook that up to an external synth or synth module, you can set them up to do something with those continuous controllers and control their effects or anything else in real time. Now you have a brand new way of controlling some of your old equipment. The last use of the D-beam that we will go over is a special effect that is in effect a monophonic synth. Turn effects on and we'll select number 62 or 63. With either of these effect numbers selected, turn the effects, the real-time effects on, and turn effects control on the D-beam controller. Wave your hand across the beam. Pretty cool, huh? Well, there's actually a million different parameters in this particular effect, and it basically mimics the parameters that you would find in an old analog synthesizer. So if you've been doing any programming of old analog synths, you'd probably be able to get around here pretty quickly. If the diagram on page 123 of the manual makes you go, then we probably should go through the nickel tour and see what each major portion of the virtual synth does. You see, sound is represented in three broad attributes. You've got your pitch, frequency, and level or volume. These three boxes here represent those three attributes in your virtual synth. The VCO, or voltage controlled oscillator, is where you will choose the pitch and your basic waveform. The VCF here, or the voltage control filter, is where you change the tonal character of the sound. You apply filter to it. And finally, the VCA is where you change the level or the volume over time. And you can see here with the VCF and the VCA, you have an ADSR or an envelope which allows you to change their characteristics over time. Hit Shift and Effects Info to get down into the parameters of the virtual synth. You can move the left and right buttons and select what part of the synth you're going to play with. Let's just start off with the VCO or the voltage controlled oscillator. So we'll hit Enter. Now there's lots of parameters here, and we can just go down to any one of them for the oscillator 1 or oscillator 2. You have two independent oscillators here. Let's go to oscillator 1 and we'll select the wave type. It can be any one of the three wave types, either triangle wave, pulse wave, and sawtooth wave. Now moving on, you have adjustable parameters for things like pitch and vibrato. If we can go down here to the pitch, the coarse pitch, this will adjust in semitones. which is half steps on a normal keyboard. If you want to make the adjustment of the pitch a little bit more subtle, go down to fine and you can detune the oscillators with each other to get kind of a fatter sound. So in brief, the VCO is where the basic pitch and type of waveform is chosen. If you click on the right cursor, you'll get into the VCF, or the voltage controlled filter, where we can change the tonal character. Move down to the cutoff, the cutoff frequency here, and we can play around with the setting to make the synth either brighter or darker. A lower setting will make it darker, or you can make it a lot brighter if you raise that cutoff there. If you want a really spacey sound, crank up the resonance, the next one there. Let's go to the right again, and we have the VCA, which tailors the volume or level over time. Now if we scroll down here, we can adjust the attack, decay, sustain, and release of a sound. So up until now we've been basically playing our pads in a manual real-time way, but we can also record that pad performance into the left-hand side of our SP-808 in either a real-time or step-time way, basically just like a sequencer, but with one added benefit. We can also record real-time audio alongside with those sequence tracks. We're about to get more familiar with the left-hand side of the 808's control surface. This is where our recorder mixer, transport, and locators are. But before we start, we need to create a new song. So let's hit Song Track and scroll down to option number 9, Create New Song, and hit Enter. From here we can name the song by using either the sample pads here or by using the value dial along in conjunction with the cursor buttons to move from left to right. Once you've named it, hit Enter, and you may have a warning asking you whether you want to continue, as the song currently in memory will lose any changes that you've made since the last time saving. Only one song can be in memory at a time, so if the current song in memory has not been saved for a while and you try to create or select a new song, you'll be prompted to save the changes. If you're going to use loops in your new song, you'll want to get the song tempo to the same tempo as your loops. That way, whenever you place a loop onto a track, the beginnings and endings will fall perfectly in line with the bar lengths in your new song. Well, how do we know the tempo? Well, perhaps you've been recording samples from, say, a drum machine. You could always check on the drum machine to see what tempo those patterns were. Also, if you've been sampling within the SP-808 and you've set your start point and your end point, then the SP-808 has already worked out that tempo for you. Go underneath Sample Bank and select option number 1. Here we see the tempo of the sample, which is calculated by dividing the number of quarter notes into the length of the sample. You'll find most dance music is going to fall in the range of 120 to about 180 BPM. If you seem to be really off in the tempo, it's probably because the number of bass notes down here is incorrect. If the 808 thinks that you've recorded 4 quarter notes or one measure, and you've actually recorded 2 measures worth of music, then the BPM shown in here is actually going to be half what the real BPM is. You can always go down to the BPM bass note and change that so that it accurately represents the piece of music that you've recorded. You'll notice as you change that, the metronome will change and allow you to see how you're doing. The really no-brainer way of setting up a song so that it conforms to a number of samples that you already have is to move the cursor down on the Create New Song screen and decide on using a pad to base the song's tempo on. We'll just move the cursor down here to pad and we'll select a pad. You can see that the tempo is automatically adjusted to the base tempo of the pad. And in fact, if you really want that pad to guide you in the creation of your new song, you can move down to the lower left-hand portion of the screen and select track A as being a guide track. What this means is that when creating a song, the SP-808 will drop this sample into the first track as a guide track, allowing that to give you kind of a guide as you're building up your mix. Of course, once you've made your song up, you can replace any or all of this track. It just provides just kind of a good guide to get you started. Set it to guide and set the end measure to 100 bars or so. And hit enter. We now have a new song set up with our first track being set up as a guide track to help us through the process of recording the new song. Now, if you ever want to know roughly what the tempo of a song, a CD, or anything else is, hold down Shift and hit the hold key. This will give us a visual representation on the screen of what the average tap tempo is. The easiest type of recording to understand, in the fact that we've probably all used tape recorders before, is audio recording. If you wanted to disregard all the other features of the SP-808, you could just use it just as a a stereo 4-track recorder. To set up for audio recording, hold down Shift and hit record. In this screen we can select what type of recording we want to make, either stereo or mono. You can then decide what will start the recording process. The first option is the play button, just like on a typical multi-track recorder. You could either select a 1 measure count in, or a 2 measure count in, or finally a pad.
Hello, tech support.
How do I tell how much time is left on my zip drive?
You can tell how much memory is left on your hard drive right from the audio record screen. You can also tell by hitting Shift and Info. I don't want to gloss over the audio recording function too quickly, because underneath it lies a way to get past this 4 pad at a time limitation. If I was to set the start with as a pad, then as soon as I hit these pads, I'll start recording into this first track, and I'll record 3 pads. Now I'll hit stop there and go to the first measure. So you're hearing 3 pads worth of information coming out of just 1 track here. I could do that with 2 more tracks and then bounce them down to the 4th track, basically giving me unlimited tracks to work with. Back to this screen, let's select to start with, say, a 1 measure count off. Now we're going to be recording in using the mic input, so we'll be seeing it on this little meter to the right hand side here. By the way, only 1 track can be recorded on at a time, so hit the track that you want to record on, hit its status button so that it flashes red. If you are recording the input from either the mic or line input, you'll need to select what this grey fader is controlling. You can see that this fader is labeled both mic line and pad. It will control the master level of the pads or the mic line inputs, and you can decide on which it will be by holding down Shift and scrub. You can see that the pad light goes on and off. If it's on, the fader controls the overall level of all the pads. If it's off, then it controls the mic line inputs. So the pad light is off, and we'll set the grey fader here to its red line, and then you can adjust the trims up here, the input trims here, of the mic input and the line input, so that the signal here up on the screen goes up and doesn't cross the dotted line. It gets as hot as you can without getting over that dotted line. Now, if you're going to be recording something in the line input, you will want to turn the mic input all the way down to the bottom so you don't record any of its input, and vice versa if it's the other way around. When you're ready to record, hit play. If you make a mistake, just repeat and you'll record over what you've just done. If you're happy with the very last thing that you recorded, just hit the undo button. That will get you back to your last take. This is something you normally can't do on a tape recorder. Now, if you want to punch in on a particular track, then you can achieve this in 3 different ways on the SP-808. Either manually, by hitting the buttons on the front panel here in the transport section. You can use a foot switch, or you can do it automatically by using the locator buttons up the top here. Let's look at manual first. To punch in manually, all we need to do is select the track that we want to punch in using and go, say, a measure or two before we want the punch to take place. We'll then hit play, and as soon as I want to punch in, I just need to hit record. Check it out. Here we're playing back the track. As soon as I want to punch in, I hit record. Now I'd be recording into this track, and as soon as I want the punch out, I'll hit record again. Now, of course, if I'm unhappy with any punch, I can always hit the undo redo button here, and that will get me back to where I was before I did the punch in. Now, if you've got your hands full with, say, a keyboard or guitar, you can achieve this punch in by using a foot pedal. Either a DP2 Roland pedal should do, I think a lot of other momentary pedals should do, but check out the DP2 made by Roland. Throw that in the back there, and that way you can keep on playing as the punch in happens. Just select Set System Parameters underneath the System Disk button and scroll down to the foot switch function. Here you can see all the functions that you can assign the foot switch to, like starting and stopping the sequencer, holding the samples like a foot damper on a piano. You can trigger samples, turning the effects on and off, and finally punch in and out. Before we discuss the auto punch function, we need to discuss these locators that line up underneath the play screen here. We have a total of 8 locators, 1, 2, 3, 4, and with conjunction with a shift button here we have 5, 6, 7, 8. These are basically like shortcuts that will take you to any point of the song, say take you straight to the bridge or the chorus or whatever. They're also used to set up for your locations for your auto punch in and punch out points. Here's how to set them. If the locators are unlit, they haven't been set. To set them, just move to the location you want. You can use the measure buttons to go measure by measure, the value dial to go beat by beat, and the shift and value dial to go in finer. But say you wanted to set a measure, say at bar 5, you just move there and get ready, drum roll. You just hit the locator bar. It's as easy as that. Now if you ever want to clear a locator, just hold down clear and hit the locator button and the light will go out. Now that we know how to set our locators, we can set the in point and the out point of our auto punch. Let's say we wanted to punch in at bar 5 and out bar 7. We would do it in this way. Let's move to bar 5 and set up locator 1, and to bar 7 and set up locator 2. Now we can move to each location of the song with just one button. Go straight to measure 5, go straight to measure 7. Now let's use these locators to set the in and out points of our auto punch. Hit Shift Auto Record, cursor down to auto punch, and we'll turn that on, and we'll select our in and out points. In point will be locator 1, which is our bar 5. 2 will be, the out point rather, will be locator 2, which is bar 7. Now we'll move the timeline to some point just before the punch. So say bar 3, so we'll have 2 bars before the punch in happens, and we'll hit play. Here we are at measure 2, we're just about coming up to our punch in point. You ready? Boom, we're in our punch in, and we'll drop out at 7. We're back into safety. This is really handy if you ever want to punch in on perhaps just a single word. You can use the scrub function to get in right in at those precise points that you want to punch in that particular word. And that way you don't have to worry about pushing all of these buttons at the same time that you're trying to get your performance and trying to get that punch just perfect. Of course, the undo button here is always the ultimate safety net if you're not happy with your punch. The other type of recording on the SP-808 is event recording, and it's basically analogous to your standard MIDI sequencer in that we're not recording audio, we're just recording our performance of playing these various pads. The good thing about that is it virtually takes up no memory because we're playing basically a playlist saying at measure 1 we hit this pad, measure 3 we hit this pad, and so on. Now these events can be recorded in 2 different ways, real time and step. Let's start with real time and hold down Shift and play. This gives us the event record real time screen. From here we can decide what will start the recording process and also whether quantize is active or not. Quantize will be a function that's familiar with those of you who have been using MIDI sequences before, and it basically means this. Depending on how good you are in your button pressing prowess here and your ability to play in time with the metronome, your performance could be everything from, say, perfect to a total train wreck. Now, quantize adjusts your timing and helps you by correcting your performance to the nearest note. If you select the coarsest of the quantize settings, which is measure, your performance will be automatically shifted to the nearest measure. If you select eighth notes, then you will be shifted to the nearest eighth notes. The trick is to try and play in time for a start and then use the finest settings you can in order to get the best results. For example, let's imagine I was playing a phrase that went quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, measure. And I set up my quantize setting to quantize to the nearest measure. What would happen is that those first two quarter notes would get slammed to the beginning of measure 1, and the second two quarter notes would get slammed to the beginning of measure 2. So the thing is, if that's set to measure, all of those little nuances will get just slammed to a very coarse measurement. That's why you've always got to look at the smallest unit of time, in this case it was quarter notes, within any particular phrase that you're quantizing, and set your quantize setting to that. You can turn the metronome on or off by holding down Shift and the metronome button. Well, that's pretty well it for real-time recording. Let's explore the last recording method, step time. Step time allows you to place these pads basically along your timeline one after the other. Like, for example, I wanted to start off with, say, 1 bar of that, followed by 2 bars of this guy. And if you're going to be laying out pads that are all of the same length, say 1 measure long, step time would probably be no deeper than that. But quite often you want to add rests, and sometimes you want to add pads that are of different lengths. Let's explore. You'll notice a pattern here. Each recording method, audio record, real time and step time record, have a corresponding button which is used in conjunction with the Shift key, audio record, real time and step event record. We've looked at audio record real time. Let's hit step while holding down Shift. The first thing you'll notice is the pop-up window that asks you to select the track that you want to work on, but before we select it, we need to talk about the new phrase parameter. If you step time a whole bunch of little samples back to back consecutively, you may get the drive too busy error. Now if this happens, set the new phrase parameter to single, and what the SP-808 will do will compile all these individual phrases into one new phrase. Now this will take up a bit more memory, but it makes the drive access a whole lot easier, because it's obviously a lot easier to go and find one sample rather than getting a whole bunch of different samples all over the disk. If you just want the 808 to take care of this, select Auto, and then the phrase creation will automatically switch between multi and single depending on the disk activity. So let's select a track and you will come to this screen. The first thing we see is the step parameter. In other words, when we add an event, how far do we then advance in preparation for the next step? Let's select measure and hit the first pad. You can see that we've automatically advanced to the next measure and the 808 is waiting for our next entry. I'll hit another pad and it will advance to the next, and so on and so on. Every event we add advances us on to the next step, and it makes no difference if we try to add these steps in any type of rhythm, like all that did was just add 14, 14, 10, 14, 14, 10. If you want to add any type of rhythm information, you'll need to do that by adjusting the size of these steps and also adding rests. Now this type of recording will probably come more naturally to those of you who perhaps grew up with written music and also using step time sequences. But those of you who have played music by ear probably get more bang for your buck with the real-time record. You can do both of them in the SP-808. Adjust the size of the steps using the value dial, and keep in mind that only one pad can be playing at a time. So for example, if you had a sample that was 2 measures long and you added it with your step length only being a quarter note long, well guess what? It'll only be a quarter note long. If you set the length of the step to be sample, then the steps will be laid down end to end depending on the length of each sample. So if you had a whole bunch of samples that were 1 measure and say 2 measures long, now all at the same tempo with respect to your song, adding them in step time would be real easy. You just add them one after the other and they'd always fall in line with the measures of your song. Now, what happens if you add a sample that was, say, a cymbal crash that was of some arbitrary length, say 2 seconds? Then everything after that cymbal crash will then be out of step with the measure markers in your song. So let's just go over the mechanics of step record, and I'll let you experiment to get your own handle on this. As we have said, you can set the step to whatever setting you wish to use in order to add samples at any portion of the measure, but we're going to do this fairly crudely and we'll add them at every whole measure. So I'll select that as step as measure, and I'll add this sample as our first bar. If I don't want that, I can always hit the previous measure button and try again. If I want to skip a step, I can press the measure next button and then add another sample as I please. If I keep hitting a sample and entering it as a step, then the sample will play back as if it was restruck every time the new step, in this case measure, happened. So each new step that I drop in would be just like I re-hit the pad. Except of course there wouldn't be any gap between those two hits there. But there may be times that sometimes I just want to extend that step. So instead of that being 1 measure long, I want it to go and keep on going. This is called a tie. If I was adding samples every bar, and perhaps I wanted to have a sample play longer instead of just re-triggering every bar, I could hit the play button. You can see that the length of the event has just been extended. It's kind of hard to see in the screen, but you'll see that there's not a re-trigger right at that new measure. It's just extended that step. For example, a sample like this might play for this long instead of just this long. Speaking of lengths, there's also a duration parameter in step record that is normally set to 100%. If you set this to less than 100%, then that sample will play for whatever is less that percentage of its original length. There's actually a nice diagram in the manual on page 69 that illustrates this well.
Hello, tech support.
How do I record to the 4-track recorder with effects?
As we said before, event recording basically records the performance of playing these pads live. So when this track gets played back, all of these pads share the same effect. If you want to record to the recorder using a different effect for each track, you will need to use the audio record function, and that you will need to make sure that your effects are on, and that underneath your effects edit, underneath the location here, make sure that your patch location is set to insert record. That will make sure that your patches, your effects are inserted in the recording loop so that all the effects will be recorded along with your vocal or whatever you're recording through your mic or line. Now in fact, if you hit Shift and Mix Common and move down here, you can set up a global setting for how your effects are located in your audio chain. Everything that you could normally do underneath the location setting of your effects edit is available here. If you don't want to make that decision for all effects, just select Effect Patch. That way the decision of where these effects are routed through the mixer is decided by our effects patch. Now we just need to make sure that our real-time effects are on. We've decided to have a send and return either through the mix common or through our effects send. The last thing we need to do is make sure that our effects button above our pads here is turned on, and away we go. Let's hit Shift and Audio Record. We'll select a track that we want to record on. Turn on our effects. I've just brought up an echo effect. Here we go, and we'll go ahead and hit play. Here's our count off. Go ahead and stop that and set this to playback. We'll turn our real-time effects off, so that way if we hear effects we know they were printed on that track rather than coming back live off our real-time effects. And we'll go to the beginning. Sure enough, there's our effect. As you can see, if you can record tracks with effects printed right on them, you could add tracks all day long with different effects on them because they're printed right on the track. Of course, this will burn up disk space doing this, but hey, zip drives are pretty cheap. Once you've recorded some tracks, you'll want to be doing some editing, and editing always comprises of selecting the tracks you're going to edit and then the region. So for example, if we wanted to erase, say, track 3 over bars, say, 5 through 7, keep that in mind. What track or tracks are we going to edit? Then we define the region. To understand the first part of the editing process, let's look at the status buttons for each track. Now, there are different colors for each status. Orange allows us to bounce tracks or remix them onto different tracks, and we'll get to this later in this section. Flashing red tells us this track is in record ready mode and is waiting for us to select any of the 3 ways we can record, either step, real-time or audio. Green allows us to hear a track played back, and off mutes the track. These are the various statuses of playback and record, and they're actually all notated on the panel along with their color. But using them with the Shift button allows us to select them for editing. In other words, if I select a region of my song that I want to edit, I'll have no luck until I select the tracks that I want to perform that edit on. Now, these status lights here are all green. That's telling me that these tracks are ready to be played back, but I don't know which ones are selected for editing until I hold down the Shift button here. Then I can select which tracks I want to edit. You'll see them lit up when you hold the Shift button down, and in fact you'll also see whether they are selected on the screen as well. If these little black boxes here are dark, then that means those tracks are selected for editing. Like if I hit Shift and deselected number 3, you can see that black box has just become clear. Let's go ahead and select it for editing. Now let's select the region that we want to edit, and this one's real easy. Using the measure buttons, value dial, or Shift and value dial, depending on how precise you want to be, locate to the point that you want to define as the beginning of your region. Now I want to use the beginning of the song as the beginning of my region, so I'll just hit the Go to Start button, and I'll hit Region In on the quick edit area here. The region button flashes and it's waiting for me to define the end of the region. I'll move forward to bar 5 and hit Region In Out again. I've now defined what track or tracks I'm going to be editing and also over what region, and now all I need to work out is what I'm going to do with them. Well, the edits are listed as a secondary function of the cursor buttons here. We have Erase, Paste, Cut and Insert. Let's erase track 3 over the first 4 measures as we've defined them. Let's go ahead and select just track 3. I'll deselect the other 3 tracks, so now we're just dealing with track C. So we're going to be doing something with track C from bars 1 through 5. Hold down Shift and erase, and she's gone. You'll notice that the space where the events were are now empty. Now if we decided to use Cut instead, then everything to the right of bar 5 would slide over to fill up that gap. That's the big difference between erase and cut. Say for example you wanted to erase the samples that were in the bridge of your song, in the middle of your song, and replace them with new samples in those same 8 or so bars that were existing there. You'd want to use erase. Now if you wanted to scrap the whole idea of doing a bridge, then you'd want to use cut. You'll normally want to select all 4 tracks, when using cut, as it chops entire pieces out of your songs, kind of cutting up tape in the old days. When you cut just one track, everything behind that single track will get moved backward in time. Consequently, all of your tracks will then kind of be out of sync. Now this is going to be fine if that's something you exactly want to do. All I'm saying is be very careful with cutting just single tracks, because you may lose your relative positions of your various tracks. The last two quick edits are paste and insert, and they both work in similar ways in that they place the region you are working on in different places in the playlist. To demonstrate this, let's select the track that we're going to paste. Let's select, say, track 2, and then by using the Mark On Quick Edit button, we can then decide which segment we're going to mark for editing. We can select segments as we did before using the Region In and Out button, or we can use the Mark function. The real advantage that Mark has over Region In and Out is that you can select non-continuous pieces of your song. Say, for example, if you wanted to say delete the first, the third and the fifth bar, for example. Let's use the Mark function to select the first 4 bars. We'll click on Mark On. You can see that I've marked the first bar. Let's go to the next bar, hit it again and again and again. You can see that they've all been marked for editing. Now unmarking is as easy as, well, you probably guessed it, Shift and Mark On gives us Mark Off. Now let's mark that one again. So I have the first 4 bars for editing, and I want to paste them to a new location. Let's move the new location to bar 5 now, and we'll hit Shift and paste. This has just taken those set of segments that we've just marked and copied them to a new location in those same tracks. Now everything in those new locations, those new bar numbers, has been overwritten. Keep that in mind. Whenever you paste, wherever that copy material is going to, all of that material there will get 86'd. If you'd rather squeeze in that new material and then push those tracks out to make room for that new pasted material, select Insert instead. So we've seen how you can select the material you want to edit. Use the Shift key and the status buttons to select the tracks that you want to edit, and the Region In and Out to select a number of bars that you want to edit, or the Mark function to select segments that aren't necessarily next to each other. We've also seen how to use the 4 quick edits, and they basically come in 2 varieties opposite each other. Erase and cut destroy data. Erase just deletes data and leaves a hole where it used to be, while cut deletes data and shuffles up the material to the right of the edit in order to fill that void that was taken. The other 2, paste and insert, basically place a copy of the selected material to a new location. Paste places a copy of the selected data in the new location and overwrites any data that gets in the way, while insert places a copy of the new data and slides all the following material out in order to allow for the inserted material. These edits done from these second functions of these cursor buttons, erase, cut, insert and paste, will probably account for probably 90% of the edits you do. But one thing it doesn't allow you to do is to copy or paste from one track to another. For those type of edits, and also specialized edits like say adjust the timing and also the volume, you'll need to go into the song track edit screens. The first edit we come to underneath the song track edit button is option number 4, which is paste. Now the first thing that should pop right out at you is that you can set different source and destination tracks. Remember, in quick edit paste you only ever pasted to the same track. Anyway, from this screen you can set what track you want to copy from and also what you want to copy to. You'll set the in points and the out points, and in fact if you ever want to check the playlist to make sure of the in and out points, just hit play. All of the transport controls are active so that you can listen to and then enter the in and outs straight from looking at the song position on the top left hand corner of the screen. Once you've made the decision of what is to be copied, the next decision is where the new location of the paste is going to be, and also the last setting is how many times do you want to repeat this paste. Set your repeat time to how many copies you want to have pasted. The more repeat times you have, the more copies you'll have pasted back to back. The next edit is number 5, move. This is just like paste in that you select the source and destination tracks, the in point, the out point of the portion that you want to edit, and the new location you want. But this time, instead of, say, a copy of that material going to a new location, the selected material actually gets moved to a new location, leaving kind of a hole where it was, allowing you to record new material in there. Insert, the 6th option underneath the song track edits, will look very familiar to you as it's just like paste. The only difference is when this new material gets inserted, all the material behind it kind of gets shuffled out in order to make room. Look, a lot of these edits will become second nature after a while, and if you've had a background in MIDI sequencing, I'm sure you'll have no trouble at all. Now, the last edit we'll get into before we get into very pitch and tempo changes is track bouncing. You might have come from a background of using old tape machines where you bounce one track onto another track, usually with a corresponding build-up of hiss and noise. Well, you can bounce all day long on the SP-808 or within the digital domain, no tape hiss. And bouncing is simply a matter of setting up for audio record, that's shift and record, set up for audio record, and then we select the tracks that we want to bounce. Just hit their status buttons so that they glow orange, and then select the track you want to record onto by selecting its status to flashing red. Now, obviously enough, if you've got a total of 4 tracks, you can only set up 3 to bounce on because you need 3 to play back and 1 to record, and even less than that if you're going to be adding a pad or 2 on the fly. Remember that 4 stereo sample limit? But anyway, you look at it, bouncing is a great thing to do. You can just keep on bouncing all day long.
Hello, tech support.
How do I bounce 3 tracks to a pad?
Rather than bouncing to another track, you can also bounce to a pad if you like. You can bounce up to 3 stereo tracks onto a single pad. Just hit sampling and select the tracks that you want to use by hitting their status button so they glow orange here, and set the start with parameter to play. Let's locate to the first bar we want to use. I want to start from, say, bar number 5, and we'll hit the sampling button. Now, it's awaiting a signal, and it'll wait there all day long for us to hit the play button. So here we go. Complete with faders. Hit sampling again, and we have our new sample. Check it out. Complete with all our fader moves. This is the most awesome capability of the SP-808. Its ability to resample tracks and pads over and over again, complete with fader moves and effects. Let's turn effects on, and underneath effects info here, let's bring up number 62, which is our synth beam. Make sure D-beam controller is on effects. Here we go. We're going to take the first 2 tracks here and the synth, and we're going to bounce all of that onto a pad. Let's go ahead and hit sampling. Decide what tracks are going to be bounced. Let's just select these first 2 here. Make sure effects is on, and also the D-beam controller effects are on, and we'll hit sampling again. It's waiting a signal. Let's move to, measure for number 5 here. Hit stop. Check it out. And we can make sure that it is actually recorded onto that track, because if we hit real-time effects off, we know there's absolutely no synthesizer coming out of our real-time effects. But it's definitely printed right on that pad along with the 2 other stereo tracks. You could do this over and over again with tracks or pads. Just make sure that their effect lights are on if you want to print those effects to the new pad or to the new track. Basically everything that you see on the front here, channel mutes, fader moves, everything will be faithfully recorded onto the new pad or the new track. We've already gone over how you can set the initial tempo for the songs that you're recording, and for most of your songs that's all you'll need. But if you ever want to change the tempo at certain parts of your songs, then you'll want to check out the tempo map. Under song track, the third option is tempo map. As you can see, the tempo for the song from the top till the end is 135 BPM. Now we can freely change that tempo. We can just use the value dial there, or we can hit a pad and have that pad's tempo set the new tempo, or we can hold shift down and hit the tap key. Any way you do it will adjust the initial tempo of your song. Now there's something we have to talk about as far as tempo changes in the SP-808, because unlike a MIDI sequencer, because when you're in a MIDI sequencer, if you speed up the tempo, all you're doing is speeding up the rate at which you play back, say, a piano part or whatever. What we do when we speed up the tempo on the SP-808 is speed up the rate that we hit chunks of audio. So for example, if I was, say I put in step time for this pad, I'm hitting it at this rate. Now if I speed up the tempo of that particular song, it won't speed up the actual speed of this individual pad. What it will do is speed up the rate that I re-trigger this pad. It'll soon be out of time. To change the tempo of these samples, you'd need to go into time stretch, as we've mentioned earlier on in this tape. Back to tempo changes, why would you need them? Well, imagine you started out a song with, say, 4 bars of this, and then followed it by a couple of bars of this. They're 2 different tempos. How could you do it?
Hello, tech support.
How do I make tempo changes in the recorder section?
Let's step record a new track. We'll select track 1 and we'll lay down 2 bars of this and 2 bars of that. Let's go ahead and play that back. And in fact, let's go into big time here so we can see the discrepancies of this timing. 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Well, kind of the first 2 bars are fine, but the last 2 bars aren't in sync at all. We need to make sure that the song's tempo is matched with the sample that it's playing. Let's go to tempo map. Song track, option number 3, tempo map. It's telling us that from the top to the end of the song, the tempo is 135. Let's hit our first pad and confirm that. Tempo is 135, you bet. Now, what we want to do is insert a tempo change into the song. So we'll hit Shift and Insert. Now we have a new tempo change in here. And we can go down here and move the cursor over to here. Let's start the new tempo change at bar 3. So that means from the top to bar 2, we have this tempo. And from 3 to the end, we have whatever tempo we want to set over here. Let's move this over here and hit the second pad that we want to use. 170, you bet, no wonder we're off. Let's hit yes. So that means from top to the second bar, the tempo of the song will be 135. From 3 to the end, it will be 170. We now have a tempo set for the song, and if we wanted to set any more, we can just keep on hitting Shift and Insert. And here's our song. That's 135 BPM, 170 BPM. Now you can insert or erase any tempo changes you like by hitting the Shift and Insert and Shift and Erase. Now there's one other thing that kind of behaves like a tempo change, and that's vary pitch. This is very much like the control you see on some tape decks that just kind of slow down the tape. Hold Shift and hit vary pitch. From here you can see that the vary pitch percentage is set to 50%. We can move down there and change that to anything we want using the value dial. We'll leave it, say, at 50% here. And once it's set, we can hit the play screen and drop the playback speed to to the speed that we have selected by just hitting the Vary Pitch button. One last thing to note about Vary Pitch is that it is tied to the sample rate that you've formatted your zip disk to, either 44.1 or 32 kilohertz sample rate. Now, if you formatted your disk to be 44.1, you can only vary pitch down. In other words, the percentage rate can only have a maximum of 100%. Where if you formatted your disk to 32 kilohertz, then you can go down and up to a maximum of 137.8%. Now, unlike a lot of other samplers that you might have used in the past, the SP-808 doesn't have any RAM or random access memory. Quite a lot of other samplers you sample into their random access with their volatile memory. That means that when you record into them, if you were to experience a power loss and you hadn't saved that to disk, you would lose everything that you'd worked on. The SP-808, on the other hand, records directly to the disk. So every sample that you record into here doesn't need any extra save function. It gets recorded straight to the disk. Song tracks, on the other hand, do need to be saved. Basically, everything on the front panel, excluding the contents of the pads, belong to the current song. Now, only one song can be in memory at a time. So if you want to select a new one, song track number 1, select song. Let's select a new one here. You'll be prompted to save the one that was last in memory. If you don't want to save the changes, just say no by hitting the exit button. When you save a song, a snapshot of the front panel gets saved along with it. Things like the status of the tracks, with the effects on or off for each track, what effect you have, locators and so on. If you want to save these changes as you go, hit Shift and Enter, give you the save screen. You've got 3 options here. You can overwrite all, you can save just the song if you like, or you can just save your effect patches. By the way, you'll also be prompted to save any time you try to eject the disk. Up until now, we've just talked about outputting the mix of the SP-808 through the master outs. But if you'd like to split up that mix a little bit, you can always use the aux outs. And if you have the optional OP1 upgrade, you can give each track its own separate out. To set what gets sent out of the aux out, hold Shift and Mix Common. Scroll down to the very last parameter. Here you can decide what the output can be set to. Let's set it to the aux output. This is basically like your effects send you'll find on your typical mixer. Do you remember how I said before that each track here, you can send a portion of that to the internal effects or the aux out? If you send it to the aux out, you can send a couple of cables from the aux out, put it into an effects device, an external effects device, out of that external effects device, and bring it back in the aux inputs. The second option is to send the pad cues out. That way you could check the pads on another mixer before your audience hears them. In fact, there's a really slick way of doing that on the SP-808 using the headphone outs. I have some headphones hooked up here. Normally when you hit one of these pads, it'll go out of the main outs. So if you're in a DJ situation, everyone's going to hear that. If you hold down Shift and hit the pad, it won't come out of the main outs, but it will come out of the headphone outs. I don't know whether you can hear that. It's a lot better to make mistakes when only you are hearing it than everybody else on the dance floor. And finally, the third option is to send track D out of the aux outs. You can see with the optional OP1 you have the first 3 already set up with dedicated outs, and you also have a full complement of SPDIF and optical jacks to transfer your mixes totally in the digital realm. By the way, if you use Vary Pitch, the digital outs will be interrupted. Now, everything you record, you come up with on the SP-808 gets recorded to zip disk. All the samples you record, the tracks that you record, even some of the real-time effects that you might have tweaked and come up with yourself, they all get recorded on a zip disk. And the SP-808 comes stock with an internal disk drive, the zip drive, but you can always add an external zip drive through the SCSI connector that's on the optional OP1 card. Now before we use these disks, we have to format them. Select System Disk and move down to option number 6, Format Disk. Now from here we can select which disk we want to format. This is normally just internal, but if you had another zip drive connected to your SP-808 through SCSI, you could select it here. We then decide on the 0.1 kHz, that's your standard CD audio, or 32 kHz. Now, here's your dilemma. You can either get 46 perfect CD quality minutes out of your SP-808 if you choose the 44.1 sample rate, but if you don't mind sacrificing audio quality just a little bit, you can get 64 minutes if you choose the 32 kHz option. And there's something else that we discussed a little earlier as far as vary pitch, because if you select 44.1 option, you can only vary pitch down. If you choose 32 kHz, you can go down and up. And here's the kicker. A zip disk can be formatted either one way or the other. The decision is yours, Grasshopper. Choose wisely. The last setting gives you the option of what type of format. Normally the quick type will do, but if you really want to perform a full format, choose full. This is normally a good idea if the disk has never been used on an SP-808 before, and it'll normally take about 10 minutes. Of course, mistakes do happen, so keeping a backup is always a good idea. Underneath System Disk, we'll go down to option number 8 here, Copy Disk All. Hit Enter, and you can see that we have the option of copying to an internal or an external disk. If you have the optional OP1 card and an external zip drive, you'll be able to change this line here to line up with your external zip drive. I don't have an external zip drive, so right now I'm just going to copy to an internal disk. So that will mean that I'll need to swap between my source disk and my fresh new zip disk in my internal drive 64 times. To back up, we'll hit Enter, save current song, you bet, and then it will read a little bit of the memory, a 64th, the first 64th off of the internal disk. It's reading that, and now it'll prompt us to put in a new blank disk. So just grab yourself a cup of coffee and start swapping disks. Options 9 and 10 underneath System Disk round out the disk copy functions and allow you to load in external samples and songs respectively.
Hello, tech support.
How do I remove unused data on the zip disk?
Depending on how much editing you've been doing on your samples and possibly your tracks, and also, more importantly, how much recording time is tied up in your undo buffer, you might have a whole boatload of unused sample time just kicking around on your zip disk. Go into System Disk and select number 5 here, Clean Up Disk. We'll hit Enter there. This will take all the unused data that's just taking up space and delete it in order to make room for your next creation. Now the SP-808 might be everything you ever need, but I've got to believe there are a lot of you out there that hook it up with all sorts of other MIDI equipment. And in fact, I've been speaking to some of the guys at Roland Tech Support, and they say that these are some of the most commonly asked questions. How do I hook this up with all of my other equipment? Well, let's go over a few applications and see what we can hook up the SP-808 with. If you have the optional OP1 card and have a computer, DAT machine, CD burner or anything else with digital or optical inputs on it, the SP-808 is the ultimate mixer because it takes 2 stereo ins, a microphone, samples, and multi-track phrases and squeeze them out through a little bitty digital out, either SPDIF or optical. This is really great leverage for your investment in your 808 because your DAT recorder has only got 1 digital input, but with that 1 digital input you can feed all of these 4 stereo tracks, your line inputs, your aux inputs, your mic, all complete with fader moves, all within a really clean audio environment. Now the next section deals a fair bit with MIDI, and I will be kind of expecting that you're up to speed as far as setting MIDI channels and MIDI note numbers and so forth. If this isn't something you're familiar with, you may want to pick up a copy of our video called Understanding MIDI. This is a pretty good primer for those of you who are new to MIDI. There'll be times that you want to sync up your SP-808 to other devices. things like sequencers, drum machines, or even tape decks. Now you can achieve this sync with other devices in one of two ways, either using MIDI clock or MIDI timecode. Let's look at MIDI clock first. Under Song Track, select Set Song Parameter and move down to this portion of the screen where we decide what the source of the sync is for your SP-808 and also what it sends out. Now before I get into the mechanics of all of this, let's briefly imagine a scenario. Imagine I am a conductor of an orchestra and you are a member of that orchestra. When I say go, you play. And you also follow the tempo of whatever my hand or baton is counting out. In this scenario, I am the master and you are the slave. Now if you were the conductor and I was the member of the orchestra, then you'd be the master and I'd be the slave. But basically, the master tells the slave when to start and also what the tempo will be. If you want another MIDI device like a sequencer or a drum machine to keep sync with the SP-808, you need to set it to send MIDI clock out. In this example, the SP-808 is the master. He's basically running the show, and whatever is hooked up to the end of the MIDI cable, the sequencer or the drum machine, is the slave. When I hit play on the SP-808, then that sends a special MIDI command telling the slave to start. And the SP-808, as it's going through its playlist, will send out timing messages making sure the slave sequencer or drum machine is playing in time and they're both in the same part of the song. If we hit stop, the slave will stop. So with sync out selected to MIDI clock, the SP-808 can control other pieces of MIDI gear that can receive it. You'll have to look at the owner's manual of whatever the slave device you have hooked up to the SP-808. Look underneath the MIDI section that tells you how to set it up so that it disregards its front panel, stop and play, and looks for an external MIDI clock. That's the MIDI clock that's going to be generated by the SP-808. By the way, the SP-808 can only be the master if you're going to use MIDI clock. It cannot slave to MIDI clock. The second type of sync that the SP-808 can send out is MTC, or MIDI timecode. Now imagine another scenario where you were a video producer and you'd produced a movie on your own video deck, and you came over and said, okay David, we're going to add some sound effects, so I need to sync up. We need to find some way to sync up the SP-808 with your video deck. Now the thing is, with your video deck, it doesn't really care about measures or tempo or anything. It's not a musical device. What it does care about is time. It cares that at say 5 minutes 30 seconds and 3 frames there's a tire squeal, and we need to add a tire squeal sound effect, and there's say a gunshot at 3 minutes 14 seconds and 16 frames. We need to work out a way that we can both read the same time. Before we get into who's master and who's slave, let's at least set up the SP-808 so that it displays time rather than measures and beats. Under System Disk, select Set System Parameters, and we'll move down here to Time Display. Let's change it from measures to time code. You can see now that the display changes from measures and beats to hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. Now we're speaking the same language, and all that's left to do is decide which is going to be the master and which is going to be the slave. In other words, am I going to press play on here and your video deck springs into action, or do you hit play on your video deck and this guy syncs along? Well, luckily, the SP-808 can either be master or slave in the MIDI timecode setup. Under the song parameter page we were just in a moment ago, you can set whether the 808 syncs to its own internal clock or to external MIDI timecode. If the 808 was going to be the slave, you would set it to this position. If you want it to be the master, set the sync to internal and let it send out MIDI timecode. Under these circumstances, you can then go ahead and add your sound effects by hitting the sample pads along while you're watching your friend's video monitor, confident in the fact that when you play it all back, everything will be in sync and all those sound effects will play perfectly in sync with your friend's video production. Now, I gave an example of using a video deck, but you could use any device that would allow you to sync or be sunk be sunk, to MIDI timecode, including a lot of the digital multitracks that are out at the moment. Speaking of multitracks, underneath the same song parameters screen you can select MMC mode, either master or slave, if you want to control other multitracks or any other devices that respond to MIDI machine control. Certain types of sequencing software will allow you to control the SP-808's transport buttons here, and also how each track is armed right from a computer screen. Now, speaking of computers, let's go over how you can use sequencers to automate the SP-808.
Hello, tech support.
How do I automate the mixer?
If you want to have an automated mix on your SP-808, you can use a sequencer, either a computer sequencer or a hardware sequencer, to record all of your fader moves. Now, all of these faders send out MIDI controller 7 on channel 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and the master on 16. And if you want to record their changes, connect MIDI out from your SP-808 to the MIDI in of your sequencer, and the out of your sequencer to the MIDI in of the SP-808. Actually, to make sure this works, you need to go into System Disk, Set MIDI Parameters, and move all the way down to the bottom here. Out through select, make sure that is set to out. That means that all the MIDI information will be coming out. If this was set to through, then nothing that is generated by the SP-808 would come out of that out through. It would just mirror what is coming in to the MIDI in. So make sure that is on MIDI out. And you'll also need to make sure underneath song parameters that you are sending out MIDI clock. Let's change that to MIDI clock. We should be in business. And from here we can use our external sequencer. In this case I'm using Cakewalk, but you could use any particular sequencer. I'll select a new track and set it so that it doesn't listen to any one particular MIDI channel, but all MIDI channels, because as I send out these fader moves, they are going to be sending out on 6 different MIDI channels, as I said, 11 through 16. So let's set up our track for recording. Hit record and play. Okay, that's enough. So let's look at our sequence track. You can see all the fader moves have been recorded here. We'll right click and look at the event list, and here are all our volume changes, the controller number 7s. It's kind of hard to see here, but there's a whole bunch of controller number 7s on the various MIDI channels that correspond to the faders on the SP-808. Now all we've got to do is hit play on the SP-808 and Cakewalk will play along. Complete with all those fader moves. All these fader moves from the screen here are being played back into the SP-808, automating the mix. Just hit stop there. So for example, if you set the SP-808 up to record, up to bounce onto a separate track, you could record that whole automated mix onto a new track. Pretty cool. Now, if you have a MIDI sequencing set up, complete with a keyboard and whatever, we're going to go through some pretty cool things you can do with the SP-808. For starters, let's play the samples through MIDI. Under System Disk, Set MIDI Parameters, we can select what MIDI channel we're going to receive on. The default is 1. You can do anything from 1 through 10. This is also just the parameter just below, where you can decide what note numbers they're going to receive on. Whatever number you set will be the first note number, which will be assigned to pad number 1. So if this was number 48, this would receive on 48, 49, 50, and so on. The real advantage of playing these samples through MIDI is the samples get played back with touch sensitivity. The pads themselves are not touch sensitive, but they are if you play them through MIDI. So that's great. You can play up to 16 pads through MIDI, but what happens if you want to change pad banks? Now you can use the pad bank button as normal, or you can change them through MIDI with program changes. Check it out. I'll send out program number 14 and voila, the SP-808 loads up the corresponding bank. Speaking of patch changes, channel 11 is hardwired to change the effects programs. So all the program changes for the effects will be sent on channel 11.
Hello, tech support.
How do I trigger the D-Beam's virtual synth from a MIDI keyboard?
If you have one of the synth beams call up in the effects like P62 or 63, you can play those virtual synths from a keyboard. Just make sure your keyboard is sending on MIDI channel 11 and the effects button is on. Well, we've come to graduation and I want to thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I'm confident that you're a lot more familiar with the SP-808 than you were just a short time ago. And don't be afraid to experiment with it. It's a totally brand new box and it's just waiting to be explored in new and exciting ways. Now before I leave, I just want to thank a few of the guys at Roland, in particular Kyle, Tony and Benjamin, and certainly the guys from East West who lent us the disc. They have some great samples. You want to check them out. And until next time, I'm David Wells, and have fun with your equipment. For more information on video owners' manuals and other Roland-related merchandise, visit the Roland website at www.rolandus.com. Studio furniture provided by OmniRacks. For complete details on their entire line of innovative workstations, visit www.omniracks.com. Sample CDs provided by East West. Visit them online at www.eastwestsounds.com.